There was a little girl who, as soon as she could talk, really, she would grab the phone. And the first thing she did was she grabbed the phone off the hook and start yelling into it, Lila, Lila, are you there, Lila? And the parents, they said, who's Lila? She doesn't have any friends named Lila and anything. And then she started talking about her husband and her children. And she named she said, and my husband's name, she gave her husband's name. And then she named her children, her 7 children, in order.
There's one more part we haven't talked about yet, and that is the appearance or the understanding and discovery of birthmarks that many times related to the death of the person that they are claiming to have been previously. So you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, yeah.
My guest today is Tom Schroeder, Pulitzer Prize award-winning journalist, writer of several best-selling books, one of which is Old Souls, which I personally read over 10 years ago. And if I had any doubt about reincarnation before I read that book, it was completely dispelled after reading Tom's book. So Tom, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
I'm so glad you're here. What I'd like to do is I'd like to actually do this in a 2-part interview with you. And in the first part, I'd like to talk about the book Old Souls and Reincarnation. And then in the second part, I would like to talk about your book Acid Test, which has a new postscript, which is LSD, ecstasy, and the power to heal, which of course looks at psychedelics and their transformative healing powers. So are you okay with me doing it that way?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Go for
excellent.
it.
Well, all right. So the first thing I'm going to ask you is, as a journalist, you approach your books with a great deal, I'm going to call, of skepticism, which I also appreciated because I love the saying that you used in your book, Old Soul. If you are too open-minded, your brain might fall out.
Well,
So,
I don't really look at it as skepticism per se. I just don't want to believe anything just because someone tells me to believe it or because I want to believe it. I want to believe something based on evidence that you can examine and reproduce. And I don't think that we can really know anything. The closest we can come to knowing anything is based on evidence that you can quantify and reproduce and have anybody experience that same evidence you do.
yep, very scientific for sure. So I'm curious to know, what were your thoughts and feelings about reincarnation before you entered this journey with Dr. Ian Stevenson?
Well, I didn't believe it existed, and actually, the reason I started getting interested in Ian Stevenson was I did a magazine story about a guy named Brian Weiss,
Very, very
and
familiar with him. He was at the very beginning of my spiritual journeys as
and
well.
he was a very respected psychiatrist in Mount Sinai Hospital
Yeah.
in Miami Beach, actually not far from where I lived at the time. And what was interesting to me, what grabbed my attention was here was this respected psychiatrist, at a major hospital, and he started writing these books about regressions of his patients that he believed demonstrated that reincarnation was real. And so I read the books and I interviewed him, and I was not impressed with his evidence of reincarnation because hypnosis is basically the whole process of hypnosis is asking people to relax and then to use their imagination, to fantasize, just to go wherever they wanted to go in their mind. And he found that some people, when what he did was, if they had a problem, he'd say, I want you to go back to the origin of this problem, to where it
Yeah.
began.
Yeah.
And he found that some of them went back beyond childhood to what they described as previous lives. but there was no content. None of his cases had any content where the subject came up with something that that person couldn't have known from reading, from history books, even from romantic novels or historical novels. And the lives tended to be, these dramatic lives from hundreds of years ago in some cases, and they were sort of the things that you would produce in fantasy. And they never had any information that you thought, well, there's no way they could have known that just from a normal source. But when I was looking into it, I read about this guy named Ian Stevenson, who was a psychiatrist in Charlottesville at the University of Virginia. And he had been actually head of the Department of Psychiatry there until he got involved in, he had an interest in the paranormal. His mother was interested in it, and he kind of inherited it. And so he would read a lot about it. And in his reading, he came across a lot of descriptions that were, they were all different from one another, and they weren't all focused on the fact that he noticed about all of them, was that in all of these cases, there were small children who began spontaneously speaking about what sounded like previous lives. And he found that fascinating for a number of reasons, because in some of these cases that he was reading about, the children came up with information that no child would be likely to know, and that proved to be accurate about the life of a dead stranger.
Yeah, isn't that crazy?
He thought that was really interesting.
Yeah.
With an adult, it's very hard. Adults have all sorts of sources of information, both conscious and subconscious. Things that, maybe they'll have a few words in a foreign language that they didn't realize they knew, but, then it turns out that they had a nanny when they were a kid who spoke that language, and so maybe it's stuck. So you can't really rely on the idea that they're just coming up with this from the fact that they actually had a previous life. But when a 5-year-old starts saying, or even a 4-year-old in some cases, starts saying these things, it can be very difficult to figure out what a normal source of that information could have been. So that was intriguing to him.
Can you give us an example of some of the specifics?
I can give you dozens of examples, because he went and he spent, at the time I went with him, he had spent 30 years going around the world investigating these cases. And I'll just mention some of the impressive cases that I saw. There was a little girl who, as soon as she could talk, really, she would grab the phone, and the first thing she did was she grabbed the phone off the hook and start yelling into it, Lila, are you there, Lila? And the parents, they said, who's Lila? She doesn't have any friends named Lila and anything. And then she started talking about her husband and her children. And she named she said, and my husband's name, she gave her husband's name. And then she named her 7 children in order. And she even said a phone number that she said was her husband's phone number. And so the name she gave, and she gave the town that she said that she'd lived in. And so the parents were fascinated by this, and they talked about it, and it sort of became known in their community. This is in Lebanon. And so it turns out that the family name that she mentioned was a prominent family in Beirut. This family lived outside of Beirut, and the daughters and the woman that she would be talking about, the wife of this guy that she said was her husband, had been flown to Virginia for heart surgery and had died during the surgery. And so the mother, the woman who died before the surgery, one of her daughters was living in South America. So she had desperately tried to call her before her surgery, because at that time it wasn't that easy to make those international calls. And the daughter's name was Lila. So remember, the little girl, first thing she did was calling the phone, Lila, Lila. And so the names that she had given for the children and the husband were matched the names of this woman who died in Virginia. And the woman who died in Virginia, not immediately, but shortly before this girl was born. And so the family was a wealthy family, and the husband's brothers, in other words, the children's uncles, did a lot of business with Saudi Arabia, where reincarnation is anathema. So they really didn't want anything to be involved in this in any way. And not only that, but they thought maybe this was some kind of ruse to get money from them. So they were like saying, we don't want anything to do with this. But the daughters, who were now grown young women, were fascinated by this, and they weren't really believers in reincarnation or anything, but they thought they would go and check this out. So they traveled to this family's house unannounced, and they walked in. And when they walked in, the little girl calls them by name and said, "You've finally come." And then one of the first things she asked them is, "Did your uncles give you my jewelry as I asked them to?" And that totally blew them away, because nobody else knew except their family that before she went in for the fatal surgery, her mother had asked her brothers to distribute certain jewelry to each daughter. Wow. And they had known. So they kind of, so this was years before I met this girl. I met her when she was 20 something. And she said, and we were asking her, well, do you still remember being this other life? She says, I remember the feelings. I've forgotten a lot of the details, but I remember the feelings. Wow. And so then we went to see the wealthy family, and we walk in, and the daughters say they didn't want to let us in. And the daughters say, well, this caused a lot of trouble in our family. You have no idea, how much trouble this caused. And so, we just, the last time when they went to visit her, there were some newspaper stories about it. And she says that really just blew the family up. But so the daughters didn't want to let us in, but the father,
so her former husband, her former husband,
right?
Okay,
was very, very. He sort of snuck us in, and then we're sitting there talking, and he gets us aside and says, I told them that. I said, when did she stop calling you on the phone? Oh, by the way, the number that she gave, it was the right number, except the last two digits were transposed. So that when she did get the proper number, this little girl would call him all the time. And he said, I didn't want to, I told her I couldn't talk to her anymore, not because I didn't want to, but because I felt like she needed to get on with her life, her new life. And we said, well, when did she stop calling you? And he kind of looked really sheepish, and he says, well, I've just been talking to her recently, but don't tell my daughters that.
Wow.
Yeah. And so I said to the daughters, I said, well, one of the things that you have to consider when you're thinking about these cases is the powerful urge to believe in this. Because,
of course.
Right. No, everybody, is terrified of dying and that being the end. And plus, when people die, you just never stop missing them.
Right.
So how reassuring it would be to think that somebody, had actually reincarnated, and And well, that's what that's what I was thinking. So that would be a reason for somebody to, stretch the truth, not to lie exactly, but to convince themselves that this little girl had said things that nobody could know. Maybe they prompted her somehow. You never know. So, so I said to them, but it must have been reassuring to know that your mother had like come back. And she said, no, it was creepy. This wasn't my mother. This was a little girl. This wasn't my mother. It was a little girl saying things that only my mother could know. So, and the fact that they didn't want to promote this, that they didn't feel comfortable with it, that they weren't being reassured by it, and yet they confirmed all this stuff was very powerful to me. So that's
Evidential information, right?
right, exactly. So, but that's just one case. There's so many cases where, there was a lot of cases where, and I run into cases even now where people tell me, oh, my little brother, when we were driving down south for the first time, and he was like 7 or 8, and he starts talking with a southern accent and saying, this is near where I lived, as we passed through some town in Georgia,
Wow.
but it never goes anywhere because they don't have, but that is a very common phenomenon, it turns out. There's a former colleague at the Washington Post who did a story about the quote creepy things that kids say, and she considered like 32 anecdotes that she got from readers who wrote in with their 8 of those involved kids talking about what seemed like previous lives. So it's not
Wow.
even, it's not, and in this country where you're likely to tell children, oh, that's not possible. My son used to say, when I was a daddy, and I treated it like a grammatical issue. I said,
Right.
no, you don't mean when you were a daddy, you mean when you're going to be a daddy. But if I had sort of been more accepting of that and explored it with them, maybe something more would have come up. So 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 there, it's possible, and some people also said, well, Lebanon, this was among the Druze in Lebanon who believe in reincarnation. And then there are a million cases in India, of course, where they believe in reincarnation. And so a lot of people say, well, that's fishy. They're just sort of going along with the cultural beliefs and sort of justifying their belief in reincarnation. And I say, well, wait a second. If a belief in reincarnation can create false cases of children remembering previous lives, then a disbelief in reincarnation could suppress real cases if they existed. So, so that didn't really, and then it turns out that there are a lot of American cases after all, and Western European cases in communities where reincarnation is not accepted, is not believed. So,
Right.
yeah. So it was a really fascinating thing. And also, none of these people that we talked to were obvious. None of them cared whether we believed them or not. They were just, we were asking them, so they were telling us what was going on. It wasn't like they were seeking the limelight or
Mm.
like they, you know,
Well, and
publish a
even in the book, I think you said several people made you give them pseudonyms because they didn't want to be known.
right, exactly. And there were also some cases where like a Muslim child would remember the life of a Hindu, which is, there was a lot of cultural conflict there. So it wasn't like that, the family was not happy with it. And then there was an Indian case that really impressed me, because there was this little girl who, as soon as she could talk, would basically say, you're not my real mom and dad, my real mom and dad. And she'd say names. And her parents punished her for that. They thought that she was being disrespectful, and plus it was creeping them out. And so one day what they told me was, well, the milkman came, and she ran out crying and saying, can you help me see my family? These people won't let me. By these people, she meant her parents. And I said, the milkman. And what they meant was, this wasn't the guy who brings the bottles of milk to the porch. This was the guy who came to milk their water buffalo.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But anyway, she said, I lived in a town that was like 30 kilometers away. And this is the name of my parents. And this guy knew a woman who lived in that town. So he when he went off, when he left and said, well, gee, I mean, I can't help you go to that town. You have to ask your parents. And so then he goes and says to this woman, this strangest thing happened to me. This girl came out and said, can you take me to my family? And she named them and said, lived in this town and you lived there. And the woman says, I know that family. And that those names are accurate. And so, as often happens in these cases, word got to that family, and their like daughter, she was a young daughter. She might have been like 10 or 12 or something like that, young teenager maybe, had been hit by a car and killed just shortly before this girl was born.
Wow.
So the father of the girl and a bunch of the men from the village that he lived in took a bus and showed up at this house unannounced. And
Wow.
the little girl was out with her sister doing something. And when she gets back, they have the way the house is organized is, they have the living area and then there's an open courtyard. And so she comes in and there's a gate and there are all these people sitting in their courtyard. The parents have given them tea and all that stuff. And they're all sitting there, including like a half dozen strange men. And she walks in and sort of stops, freezes, and looks around. And one of the men says, Preeti, can you show us who your father is? And so she runs up and jumps up on the lap of the father of this dead girl and puts her arms around him, says, Papa, can you take me home? And so there are all these witnesses to this that we interviewed. We interviewed the witnesses. And then we went to the previous family's home and interviewed the whole family. And then one of them told us that when she got there, then they took her there and she led them the last few blocks, through this winding streets of the village. She ran and they all followed her, and she ran into the courtyard of their house, and the whole family was there. And she looks around, and there are all these siblings there, and she says, where is my older sister? She's not here. And there was one sister who was living with her husband's family, and the sister that she said. So, and they all said, yes, this all happened just like this. So, it's very impressive, these cases, very hard to explain away. And, there's a lot of sort of reasons you could explain, like, maybe they gave visual clues, like when the little girl walks in the gate and says,
everybody looks at the dad.
Maybe everybody looked at the dad, they denied that they did this, but you can't, we weren't there, so we couldn't tell. And, and maybe the family, in their enthusiasm, concocted this thing where she asked, where's, the other sister? Maybe they, like, somebody had mentioned her, and one sibling didn't hear it, but the other one said something about the missing sister. Like, too bad Imelda isn't here, or whatever. So, but when you start adding all this stuff together, and the fact that this isn't like an isolated case, that there are dozens and dozens of cases with situations that are this impressive. And in many cases, there's certain things that, that sort of that sort of go against the arguments against this. For instance, like I said, some people say, oh, the family wants to believe this. Well, I saw that family that didn't want to believe it and didn't feel comfortable with it, and yet, confirmed that this stuff had happened. So it ends up being extremely difficult to, and there are other sort of psychiatrists and social scientists who have studied, Stevenson work, and some have done their own case investigations. And, what they sort of cautiously say is that in some of these cases, it is very difficult to come up with a normal explanation that explains them. That's as far as they'll go.
I think my favorite was the detractor who said it's either reincarnation or they have extrasensory perception that's almost like God.
Yeah, right. But then the extrasensory perception thing, sort of like, well, maybe this kid is just like, but they're not saying, oh, that child had this situation. That child had three horses.
Right. They're saying me.
They're saying I did.
Right.
I did. They're also having the emotional attachments. So the ESP didn't seem like a very convincing explanation to me. But of course,
if somebody has ESP, they don't usually have it in one area. They have it in lots of areas.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is a very specific, and the other thing about these cases versus like the hypnosis cases is they weren't remembering being, a glamorous movie star.
Yes.
Or a baseball champion. What they remember being was an unemployed mechanic who got drunk a lot. I mean, there was nothing glamorous about the lives that these kids were remembering. Some of the research we did on, and the Preeti, the one who remembered being the little girl in this village with all the siblings, and where we went and interviewed both families. We also wanted to look into the death of their original daughter, the family's daughter, the death of the girl that Preeti remembered being. And we wanted to find the circumstances. So we're going out, this was 25 years ago or more, 7 years ago when we were doing this in India. And so we go to this rural police station, and it's basically open air. And we say, well, there was a traffic accident 7 years ago. And would you have any records about where a fatality occurred? And by the way, as we're driving into the police station, there's this smashed minibus on the other side of the road with a dead body in the driver's seat. And we're going, because at that time, I looked it up because we were doing all this driving and all these sort of sketchy vehicles on bad roads with camel drawn carts and everything. And at the time, fatalities per person in India were 40 times as much as they were here. So you're 40 times more likely to die in an automobile accident in India. And so there's this dead body there in the smashed car. And we go into the police station, and the sergeant is arguing with one of his underlings. He wants him to go clear the body. And the underling has said, let the family do it. I'm not going to do it.
Oh my gosh.
Right. It's quite the scene. So anyway, they show us to this closet that has all these bound books, they're with handwritten entries, and they've tumbled off the shelves. So there's some on the shelves, and then there's this whole pile of them just sitting on the floor. And we start digging through them, looking for the one for the year that we're talking about. And so finally we find it, and then we find the report of the accident. And the thing about one of the things that Preeti had said was that her last memory was that falling from a height. The last memory was falling from a height. And then so we look and says, well, she was hit by a car, so that seems wrong somehow. But then there's a description in the thing that a witness said that the car hit her and knocked her like 12 feet in the air. So
falling from a height.
Yes, right. So that really freaked me out.
Those are such incredible stories. And I would imagine that with 2 trips, I mean, you've just told us 2 of, I think he has like 4,000 examples, and I don't even know how many you encountered a lot on these 2 different trips that you did.
Yeah.
So as you're on the first trip, and you are in Lebanon and you're seeing all of this firsthand, and you're talking, you're spending time with somebody who's spent their whole entire life researching this and believing in this. Like, how are your beliefs beginning to shift and change as you're going through this process yourself?
Well, and this came out 25 years ago next June. And so in that time, that's the question I've been asked more than any other. This has been in print and selling copies for 25 years. And I am constantly getting people asking me that. And I've never been able to answer it because, like I said, my core belief is that, that you can't know anything unless there's reproducible, investigatable evidence. And then it's only a theory, because there's always a possibility of more evidence coming up that could contradict your current theory. Then you change your theory. And the problem is that nobody had any kind of persuasive argument for how this could occur, what the mechanism was, what a soul was even, or what was it exactly that transferred from one person to the next. Nobody had a good explanation for that. And certainly there was no evidence for it, for a mechanism that allowed that to happen. So I really struggled. On the one hand, there were all these cases where I didn't think the children were delusional, or the people who witnessed it. I didn't think they were lying, most of them. Some of them could have been, but certainly, most of them didn't. There was no evidence that they were lying, no evidence that they were deluding themselves out of, the need to believe this. They were just recounting their experiences. So I really went along with that researcher said that in many cases, trying to think of a normal explanation seems a little more difficult than believing that it's something that we don't understand. And so I was kind of stuck between the fact that I believed that these children were just relating their actual experiences, and the fact that there was no evidence that of how this could actually happen. What could make this happen? It was just sort of like magic. And not only that, but as the years went by, there was more and more evidence that what we think and believe and do is all the result of organic reactions in your brain. For instance, these researchers recently, not too long ago, were able to find out exactly where in a rat's brain a memory of a shock resided. They were given electric shocks, and they could actually find the molecules in the brain that changed as a result of that shock, and that made them fearful of the situation that they got shocked in, where a mouse who hadn't been shocked wasn't fearful of it. Okay, so that's a thought and a feeling in the rat's brain where they've actually found the organic molecules in the brain that created that. Not only that, but they were able to artificially insert those same molecules in rats who hadn't experienced the shock, and they behaved exactly like the rats who had, fearful of getting the shock. So that suggests that our thoughts and feelings actually are made up of the neurons and other chemical and electrical reactions in the brain. And if that's the case, then all our thoughts and feelings when the brain dies and disintegrates are gone. And there's no suggestion about how those experiences could transfer. So there's more and more evidence that everything we think and feel and do is a product of an incredibly complex organic chemical reactions occurring in the brain and the body.
Yeah.
So I had this anyway. So for this 25th anniversary edition, I really tried to knuckle down and deal with my ambivalence about all of this. And it took me 6,000 words.
Wow.
To do it.
Okay.
Yeah, because it's a complex. I think I say the answer is complicated.
Okay.
And I'm not going to reveal it here. Hopefully, when it comes out, you can go
by the new edition one, the 25-year anniversary edition.
Right.
Okay. Well, if what you've just shared with the thoughts, that's one thing. The evidential information that they had is another thing. There's one more part we haven't talked about yet, and that is the appearance or the understanding and discovery of birthmarks that many times related to the death of the person that they are claiming to have been previously. So you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, I mean, he has a whole huge volume of cases where there are birthmarks that seem to be related to injuries from memories that they had in a previous life. And of course, that's a double-edged sword, because if somebody has a prominent birthmark, they're going to be looking for some explanation for why they have that birthmark.
But and maybe not when they're 5.
Yeah, maybe not. But maybe somebody else in their family notices it and says, oh, that reminds me of this and this. But, some of them are quite eerie. And then also, some of them, well, it's like 18 centimeters different from where the bullet entered. The birthmark is like 18 centimeters away. But, because of the growth, because of the way, the child matures, maybe. So, there's a whole different set of objections to those. But they're also quite eerie in some cases.
Well, will you want to share a couple that you found to be particularly eerie?
Yeah. Well, there was this this guy who remembered as a child, who remembered being someone who had been murdered, and he had been shot, and the bullet went into in through the jawbone and then out the other side. And he had 2 birthmarks, one on the jawbone there and one on the other side. And he had talked about the life of, but it was a person in the same town, so he could have heard the stories about this murder as a child and connected it to his birthmarks. And then there was another one where, and this is something that isn't even Stevenson. It was me. There was this, after we did all these cases in Lebanon and India, I said, well, what about, cases closest to home? And there were a lot of cases, but so many of them that where they said enough to identify somebody, and we live in a society that's sort of scattered and mobile and everything. Sure. So, it might be harder to make those connections, but the ones in the American cases at the time mostly involved like relatives, which is very problematic because the family has that information. And even if they don't think they've conveyed it to the child, maybe they had, or maybe the child's heard people talking about it, the parents didn't know about it, or maybe the child found some old photo albums or whatever. But this woman who who contacted me, her son kept remembering living in the, she lived in this town, and every time they passed this farm, the son said, I lived there. That's where I lived. And then he started telling me stories about, how he got in trouble for smoking out by the barn, and, he got punished for it, and, various things. And so we kind of put it together, and the patriarch of this family that lived there had died just before the child was born, and he had a daughter who still lived in this house. And I asked the mother, I said, have you ever taken him to see this person? She said, well, no. And I said, well, do you want to go do it? And so we go there and knock on the door, and this little bubbly little boy is like, the woman opens the door, and the little boy suddenly starts crying, and he's like clinging to his mother's skirt, hiding behind her and everything. And we start talking to her about her dad who had died, and she was saying how much she loved him and everything. And before we went, just having conversation, I had lunch with her, and we're sitting there and the kids running around. And I noticed that he had this big kind of mole on his head. And I said, gee, have you had anybody look at that? It looks a little suspicious. Maybe you ought to get somebody to look at that. She goes, yeah, I was thinking the same thing. I guess we should do that. So anyway, we just had that discussion, and we started asking about the father's life. And some of the things the kids said seemed to match up pretty well with the father's life, but other things didn't. For instance, he kept saying there was a Ferris wheel on their property, had been a Ferris wheel on their property. And the daughter had no idea what that was about. She said, no, there's never been a Ferris wheel. But then, we were saying, well, how did he die? And how was his health? And she says, well, he ended up having a tumor. And I said, well, where was it? And she says, well, it was right there, right where the kid's thing was.
Wow.
And then when we left, we asked the boy, we said, well, why were you crying? And he says, I don't know, Mom. Why is that? So he was asking the same thing. But anyway, I think that all of this stuff is extremely compelling, extremely hard to explain or away. And yet, it's hampered by the fact that there doesn't seem to be any reasonable way that this could actually happen. So, that's the thing I grapple with, and have been grappling with for a quarter century.
Wow, that's incredible. Well, Tom, if nothing else, I think people should read your book, Old Soul, just so they could see through your eyes, because you were an extremely descriptive writer. I felt like I was in India and probably would never want to go. And also was in Lebanon, because your description, the way that you write, it really brings everything to life. I can understand why you have won awards and why your books are best-selling.
This research was quite the adventure,
I bet.
and and he'd been doing this for 30 years, and starting in the 60s, when things were even more remote and more difficult than they were when I was there in the 90s.
Did you stay in touch with him until he died? Because he was like 90, in his 90s when he died, 91 maybe? Can't remember, 92?
Probably, because I think that's right, because he was 80. He just
Almost
turned
80, like 79 when you were going.
yeah. Yes, I did stay in touch with him. And he, unfortunately, he had when I was with him, he had this lung ailment, and he'd walk me into the ground, and he wouldn't stop for lunch. He was amazing. And yet at night, I'd have the room next to his and I'd hear him coughing his lungs out all night, which was very concerning.
And
And then,
ultimately, he died of pneumonia, I read.
yes, and that was actually all related to this lung ailment that he'd had for years. And it was a very, his last year or so was not pleasant. As so many, final chapters are. There was pretty tough.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, I want to thank you for writing this book because this book was really special in my spiritual journey. I've been on a journey for more than 20 years, and I feel like you become a new person about I feel like now maybe every 2 or 3 years, I become a new person because I absorb so much information, and especially in this, time when we can watch videos and connect to people and hear different experiences. And I just think it's really wonderful to be able to connect with somebody whose life's work was to try and uncover and understand some of these stories. But for me personally, after I read these, I had absolutely no doubt, and I've read other things as well, but no doubt. I actually did a video, I'm going to link it here, where I talked about some of the American cases that I thought were extraordinary that I came upon in my research about reincarnation. So let everybody make their own decision. And if you want to hear what Tom's final summation and his opinion is, you can catch his new upgraded 25-year anniversary copy of The Old Souls. So, Tom, thank you so much for doing this interview. I am so grateful to be able to talk to you and connect and hear your stories.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it.
So, if people want to find your book, where can they find it?
Well, the usual places. It's on Amazon, of course, and there are bookstores that have it. Some do, some don't, but you can always find it online.
Are you collecting stories? So, if people that are watching have these experiences in
I
their
got some. I've had some people contact me over the years, and some of those are in the afterword that I wrote for the 25th anniversary. One in particular that was especially meaningful to me.
Oh, well, I'm definitely going to pick it up because I'd like to read what you wrote and also get the new information too. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us to talk about this. I really appreciate it.
Really, my pleasure.